Tuesday, May the 4th, and you're watching GoodFellows, a Hoover Institution broadcast exploring social, economic, political, and geopolitical concerns in this time of pandemic. I'm Bill Whalen. I'm the Virginia Hobbs Carpenter Fellow in Journalism here at the Hoover Institution, the moderator of today's show. That means I have the privilege of introducing the stars of our show, three Hoover Institution senior fellows we jokingly refer to as the GoodFellows. We begin with John Cochrane, aka the Grumpy Economist. That's the title of his podcast and blog. John is also the Hoover Institution's Roseberry and Jack Anderson Senior Fellow. Hello, John.
Hi, everybody, and let me start the litany of bad jokes by wishing you all a happy doomsday.
Well played, sir. Our second good fellow, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. He's a former presidential national security advisor, and he is the Hoover Institution's Fuad Michelle Ajambi Senior Fellow. Hello, H.R.
Hey, Bill, great to see everybody. I think we're all back in California, and I am looking forward to Doom.
Pun number two. Our third good fellow, Niall Ferguson, the Hoover Institution's Milbank Family Senior Fellow. Niall's a renowned historian and author. His latest book, Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe, was released today. It's out on the bookshelf, so go get it. That's why the bad puns to start the show. And that is indeed the topic of today's show, Doom. Neil, congratulations. A question for you, my friend. How much of your immediate future is going to be tied up in the pursuit of discussing doom in venues like this?
A lot. In fact, I'm doomed to be interviewed near to death. I don't think anybody's ever died of book publicity, but death by interview one day will happen. And I hope I won't be the first medical case to go into the history books, because it's surprisingly tiring to talk about your own book. And HR will confirm this because he's just been through the process with his own book. After a certain point, I find I stop believing my own arguments because I've heard them from myself too often, and my natural contrarianism kicks in, and I have to restrain myself from disagreeing with my own book.
So Neil, your willingness to talk about your book is my cue to ask you about your book. And let's start with the title itself, Doom, Politics of Catastrophe. Explain the phrase Politics of Catastrophe.
Well, the book really originated before the pandemic with my thinking a lot about dystopias and disasters, and particularly the role of technological change in disastrous scenarios. I'd gone through a long period of not reading science fiction, and I suddenly took it into my head that for a historian only to read history might be bad practice, because the one thing history is not good at doing is giving you a sense of plausible future technological changes. So I had a big science fiction binge in 2018, 2019. And it was partly because I had been immersing myself in books like Margaret Atwood's trilogy, seen enough science fiction pandemic scenarios to know just exactly what to look for back in January last year. I wanted to write a book that contextualized disaster, and that meant bringing all the different kinds of disaster together in one place to try to think about them systematically. And I realized that hadn't really been done before. Now, being a Scotsman and therefore naturally rather a pessimist, the phrase "we're doomed" is one that the English associate closely with the Scots. I probably have an emotional predisposition to think a lot about disastrous scenarios. I was brought up to always be thinking about the worst case scenario because, as my Uncle Jimmy liked to say, you'll sometimes be pleasantly surprised, but you'll never be disappointed. So there's a kind of there's a sort of psychological quirk here that if one thinks a lot about disaster, in theory at least, one's better prepared for it. And this is a quite un-American way of thinking, because Americans like to be on the sunny side of the street. But that's the sort of background to the book. And the politics of catastrophe is a phrase that's very important, because one of the key arguments of the book is that really all disasters are in some measure politically constructed, that to talk about a natural disaster as opposed to a man-made disaster is a little bit of a false dichotomy, because even a volcanic eruption is only disastrous in terms of excess mortality if a bunch of people decided to build a city right next to the volcano. I think a pandemic starts with a novel pathogen in the case of COVID-19, but it's actually the responses of governments that determined how disastrous that novel pathogen would be. remember, in Taiwan, precisely 11 people have been recorded as dying of COVID-19, and Taiwan is right next to the epicenter where the pandemic began. So the politics of catastrophe is really the theme. Disasters ultimately are all man-made in some sense, even if it's only to the extent of deciding to build a large city near a volcano.
Okay, John and HR, you've read the book. Have at.
You want to go first for a change, HR? I always jump in and grab too much of this.
Sure. I'd just like to say congratulations, first of all. The book is really brilliant. And, my expectations were high, Neil. You far exceeded them. And I think you will for all readers. So what I just want to just share with our listeners, and our viewers, this isn't a book that just imparts knowledge about disasters. I think it's a book that imparts wisdom. I think we get to see how Niall Ferguson thinks about the world. And I think it's a sterling example about how to think about the human experience and how to use knowledge of the past to understand the present and then make a grounded, reasoned projection into the future. And Neil, what I'd like to ask you is one of the themes that runs through the book is our desire to impose order, to effect control over our circumstances and conditions and our futures. And the reality, which is quite the opposite, that we find it quite difficult to predict what's going to happen next, and that we are continuously interacting with one another, with our environment, in a complex way. You use complexity theory throughout the book and network science. Could you just maybe describe for our viewers what we get wrong, when we try to predict what's going to happen in the future, or we try to exert control, either over ourselves or over our natural environment?
Well, first of all, thanks for the kind words, HR. I think that the problem, the central predicament in which we find ourselves, is that we really would quite like to be able to foresee the future with much greater precision than is possible. And we would quite like to have a sense of what the probabilities are of various scenarios, good and bad. And that's actually not really possible. So throughout human history, we've tried to come up with mental hacks that give us some sense of being able to anticipate the future, whether it's through religion, which is really how most societies try to make sense of the somewhat chaotic nature of life, or more recently with models in secular political and social science. In my field, that there's been a long struggle to try to come up with a cyclical theory of history, because if only there's some discernible cycle, then we should have a sense of roughly what's coming next. And this is enormously attractive. People keep coming back to the idea that there could be historical cycles. Generational cycles, for example, are recurrently attractive. The terrible, sad truth is that there can't really be such predictable patterns in history, because there's just too much that's chaotic about the historical process. And the best illustration of this, I think, is the way that disasters happen. Disasters, whether they're wars or pandemics or massive earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, droughts, you name any disaster you like, they are not normally distributed in the way that road accidents or human height are normally distributed around a bell curve. Quite the opposite. They can be randomly distributed. There's no pattern to the incidence of war in history, and war is your special subject. HR, you'll know that there have been two absolutely vast wars in modern history and a great many small ones, and there just isn't a pattern in the data that allows us to say what the probability is of World War III and when it might happen. Same goes for massive earthquakes. Same, John, goes for economic disasters.
Absolutely.
We've had one Great Depression. We came close to having another maybe after 2008, but that's not a huge sample size of Great Depressions. And we have lots of recessions, but they vary enormously in their size and duration. So here's the bad news. If it's really the case that history is one damn disaster after another, the way that disasters happen and the variety of forms that disasters take more or less rules out any predictable future. There's just a lot of uncertainty. Some things are predictable. Let's not exaggerate here. It's pretty clear that the weather is going to get warmer as we're now in May. And in the Northern Hemisphere, we know that it gets warmer. That's predictable. But can we predict the next major earthquake on the San Andreas Fault, which we hope won't happen while we're on this show? No, we really can't. Or we know that there is likely to be one, but we just don't know when, we just don't know how big. And that's the fundamental problem of human existence. Much more uncertainty than we are comfortable with, and much less calculable risk.
So I want to, actually, I'm going to ask another HR question, but emphasize that. I take that as a lesson of your book. That certainly is my view of economic policy, and that our economic policymakers, it's hilarious. They give you the forecast and then tell you what we're going to do. And then I have raised my hand and said, well, what are your scenarios that you're worried about? And they say, well, here's the forecast. Here's what we're going to do. And I think this tells you something, that if these events are inherently unpredictable, as certainly economic crises are by definition unpredictable, because if you knew it was going to happen tomorrow, you'd go take your money out today and it would happen today. And I think that holds of all the other ones. If things are inherently unpredictable, there is something you can do about it. You don't know when the earthquake's going to come, but you know what it's going to look like when it comes. You can make plans for that. And moreover, you can think about all the bad things that could happen. And here's where I think military has, HR, I'm going to invite you to give a speech. If anybody is familiar with disaster, it should be military historians, because by definition, every war ends in a disaster for at least one side, and usually both of them. And you spend your life thinking about how to, you start with can and don't let them envelop you on both sides, right? No, I think the answer is you cannot plan. No plan survives contact with the enemy, but you must be flexible and in your ability to adapt to what happens. That may be what I would take the notes. But what does the military historian tell us about the right way to handle all the things military were? Don't fight the last war. Don't build a Maginot Line because they're going to go around you again in Belgium. You certainly have studied how to survive disasters and should have lessons for the rest of us.
Yeah, well, I asked Neil to comment on this too, because his chapter on political incompetence begins with a discussion of military incompetence and the traps that we fall into, cognitive traps and heuristic biases and so forth. And Clausewitz, the great Prussian philosopher of war, I think would have loved Neil's book, right? Because he said, they aim at fixed values, but in war, everything is uncertain. And I think one of the critical elements of setting up military organizations for success in battle, in combat, is to ensure that they are capable of operating under conditions of profound uncertainty. A way to do that is really consistent with complexity theory, right? You create organizations that have the combinations of capabilities that allow them to operate semi-autonomously and to cope with a certain part of that complex problem set in a way that creates multiple dilemmas for the enemy and maintains their freedom of movement and action. And an organization that can adapt very quickly to changes in circumstances, identifying opportunities or protecting against dangers. But I'd ask Neil to comment on this and what you learned, what you think about the lessons from military history as they apply to political decision-making as well. And I really enjoyed your section, if you wouldn't mind summarizing it, on heuristic biases and cognitive traps, because I think on our show, John and Bill and we talk about this implicitly, through in every one of our episodes, especially those that dealt with our response to the pandemic.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I faced writing this book was that I wanted to bring under the same roof military disasters and natural disasters, as well as economic and public health disasters, because it struck me that there were certain common features that we could try to identify. And the great thing about what you just said, HR, is that it reminds us that the military has had to recognize the power of uncertainty for a very long time. And Clausewitz's great contribution was to encourage generals to realize that very few plans survived contact with the enemy, and that fog descends almost the minute military operations begin. I think that's true of everything. And part of the problem that we have in public health in the US in 2020 was that it turned out that the public health bureaucracy at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Department of Health and Human Services were not at all attuned to thinking about a crisis the way people in your world are. And their plan, which existed in multiple editions, heaven knows there were lots of pandemic preparedness plans, disintegrated on contact with the pathogen, one might say. So I do think there's an important insight here, which we can import from the military realm into the civilian realm, that there needs to be a degree of decentralization of command, and the initiative needs to be in the hands of relatively junior people to improvise rather than to wait for orders from the center. One of the things I do in the book is revisit one of the great military disasters of British history, the Battle of the Somme in 1916, something I wrote about more than 20 years ago in The Pity of War. I remember when I was learning the history of the First World War, being very surprised to find that the highly centralized army that waited for orders before acting in the field was the British army. And in fact, the German army, contrary to national stereotype, was the one that was highly decentralized and in which non-commissioned officers were encouraged to take the initiative. So it was very interesting to revisit the Somme and think about it, read up on some of the more recent literature, and realize that this was an absolutely classic military disaster, in the sense that once the plan began to unravel, which was almost immediately, there was no real sense, at least on the part of the junior officers in the field, that they had any options other than to plow on. And that meant enormously high casualties for almost no real gain. I think that problem of the rigid plan that you stick to, even when it's obviously failing, is a problem that's to be found in many different walks of life. You mentioned the problem of cognitive biases, and behavioral science and behavioral psychology have become very, very fashionable fields of study. I'm expecting John to be a little bit skeptical about some of this work, because I know from conversations we had while I was writing the book that he's not an entirely convinced believer that we human beings are just hopelessly bad at assessing risk. But if you run through the list of different cognitive biases that I talk about in the book, the availability bias, which means we rely on information that's readily to hand or that we can easily remember, hindsight bias, which means we attach higher probabilities to events after they've happened than we did before they've happened, the problem of induction, which leads us to formulate general rules on the basis of insufficient information. And I could go on: fallacy of conjunction, confirmation bias, contamination effects, the effect heuristic, scope neglect, overconfidence and calibration. That's a phenomenon that is very frequently encountered in academia. Bystander apathy, that long list of quirks in the way that we think as human beings does help explain why, in the face of an approaching disaster, so many governments and individuals last year made terrible decisions. And this is why it's quite helpful to hang the argument on the recent disaster and not by any means over disaster of COVID-19, because this was a disaster that was frequently predicted, to the point that it was almost monotonous to find yet another TED Talk or article in Foreign Affairs about the coming pandemic. And on paper, we were prepared for this. And yet when it struck, it turned out that we were completely unable to cope with it as well as people in, say, Taiwan or South Korea. A part of the explanation for this must be a kind of bureaucratic rigidity and an inability to be flexible when the battle begins. But part of it is obviously that we're just not terribly good at assessing risk, even when we have quite a bit of data about the risk.
So I think, as you know from our long discussion on it, behavioral biases are real. But I think, as you just said in the second half of your statement, they miss the point. People do dumb things sometimes. People put together in government agencies do even dumber things. And in fact, your story is one of not the story of individual misperceptions of risk, but of social, government, economic, bureaucratic structures that are unable to react even when the individual people understand the risks pretty darn well. And I think that's a more interesting story. That's my antipathy to behavioralism is not due not at all to the fact of how its description of how people behave, But too many behavioral economists jump to the conclusion, well, the people are all poor little morons, so the government agencies must decide for them. Whereas, in fact, any social psychology will tell you that a government agency, a group of people, especially a political group of people, is likely to make far worse decisions. Our discussion with Steven Pinker was very good on that. But so I want to just, I think I want to summarize a little. Then I've got more questions when it's my turn. But the word resilience is the one that I see in all of this. You have to the first thing you do in a war is don't lose. Live to fight another day. In my own, recently I've been thinking about financial regulation. Our current financial regulators view to risk. They're now worried about climate risk, and they want to figure out exactly what's going to happen for the next 100 years and exactly who's going to gain and lose how much money and so forth. That seems not very useful. If you really worry about financial risk, what you want is a huge amount of capital so that the financial system can survive no matter what hits it, which might be climate, it might be a pandemic, it might be a war, it might be a cyber attack. And I think that's the fundamental. We need social, bureaucratic, economic, military structures that are resilient to the unplanned things that are going to hit them, as opposed to elaborate plans. And part of that resilience is exactly what you mentioned, the ability of people out there with the information to handle things, as opposed to try to centralize and foresee a response.
Yeah, I learned a lot from reading books by Nassim Taleb in the last few years. And one of my favorites of his is Anti-Fragile. And Taleb's argument is that we tend to construct complex systems, for example, of financial regulation, that are very fragile. They're optimized, they're very efficient, but they turn out to be very fragile when they're struck by some perturbation, by a disaster. And the ideal system, and this can be found in the natural world, is one that's actually anti-fragile. What doesn't kill it makes it stronger. And if you can't achieve that, then at least be resilient. If you're a bank, have more capital than you had in 2008. If you're a public health system, you probably want some capacity for intensive care that seems like it's surplus most of the time, but my goodness, you are glad you have it when the crisis strikes. And if we look at the countries that are in parlous situations at the moment, India in particular, the problem is just obviously a problem of insufficient capacity for such a crisis. And because disasters are not normally distributed, there are these fat tails, another thing that Taleb wrote about in The Black Swan. You just have to accept there needs to be some apparent redundancy in the system for the eventuality the disaster strikes, because the disaster is probably more likely than you're assuming. It's just that big disasters don't happen frequently enough to persuade us to have that kind of resiliency. And this is where historians have a role to play. Living memory is not that great. How many people really had any memory of the 1918-19 influenza? Almost none could really claim to remember that when COVID-19 struck. And so the historian's job is to say, there are things like pandemics or really big wars. They may only happen every once or twice a century, but you can't assume that their probability is so vanishingly small that you don't need to prepare for them. So the challenge, I think, and this is a key point that I'd like to get your thoughts on, both of you. And how do we, in our various public services, this may also be a challenge for private entities too, how do we build that kind of resiliency? Because it seems to me that what's really striking about the last year and a half is that the fragility comes from a particularly bureaucratic mindset. One might even say legalistic. You are very well prepared for a certain scenario that you've given all your attention to. You've got the 36-page report and the 100-slide deck, and you are prepared for that disaster. Or you're preparing, as John just described, for the disaster of climate change. And you've got pages and pages of preparations based on your model and the scenarios that your model has generated. It's just that that's not the disaster that you get. And I'm trying to think about how we can get away from this rather bureaucratic approach to risk management, which says, well, there is this risk, we can imagine it, and here are the regulations that we're going to devise to deal with the risk. This is it's sort of about being exactly wrong rather than roughly right.
Well,
And this seems like a pathology throughout the bureaucracy, wherever one looks, really, an inability to be flexible and responsive to a pretty wide range of disasters. How do we get there? I'm not sure I quite know the answer to that question.
Let's take some successes. So aviation safety, I think, is a success. Jets are unbelievably safe. This did not come automatically. This came after long, hard work. And this was a bureaucracy. The combination of the FAA and the industry worked together on this one. And they paid attention to the H1N1 and the SARS and the Ebola. They had lots of they tracked all the near misses, all the problems. They got ways to get that information together and implement it. I would say this is what the US military specializes in. We don't fight a big war that often, but we fight lots of little wars, which battle tests things and force, armies that sit there for 50 years and do nothing around the world seem to get less and less competent. So learning the lessons from the regular small ones in a process of continuous improvement there's two examples that do seem to sort of work.
Yeah. Well, I think that this has a lot to do with the theme that runs through Doom, which is this tension between whether you believe the future lies more in the realm of certainty or more in the realm of uncertainty. And I think once you come down on one side or the other, there are a series of other assumptions about the nature of our world or of a particular part of our world and human experience that flow from that. So if you think the future is certain, then you can have perfect plans and you can centralize control, right? And you can look for conformity in following those plans. You'll have a relatively centralized organization. You're going to be biased in favor of efficiency, over effectiveness and resilience, like we saw our supply chains become over time. And I think that as I was reading Doom, I was thinking about this orthodoxy of a revolution in military affairs in the 1990s, which I think was a big setup, for some of the strategic shocks and disappointments that we encountered in the 2000s. And so I really think that it has everything to do with the main theme in the book. And what I would like to ask Neil, back to you on this is, first of all, do you agree with that? And then you write extensively about networks, which I've learned a lot from you about networks on the PBS film, some of the essays you've written. And what we've seen with the pandemic, right, is how networks can transmit and move a malady through it quickly to have a major effect on us in connection with COVID-19. I think we see that with social media, right? How networks associated with social media can affect us psychologically in a way that is profoundly negative. But what I wanted to ask you is, with these characteristics of networks that you write about, which I think is really a unique way to think about them, right? This is that, no man is an island, right? So we're connected. Birds of a feather flock together. We tend to be around people we enjoy, like we enjoy each other's company so much in GoodFellows that weak ties are strong, which means that even if you're only tenuously connected, just the magnitude of those connections make those networks strong. That the structure determines the virality, like how quickly it can move through networks, and then networks never sleep. So if these are the characteristics, Neil, what's the good side of those networks, right? I mean, can we apply the nature of networks to the cure as well as understanding the disease? And so, I hate to use this term, but how can we build back better? How can we emerge stronger, like the English state did after the Black Plague, as you write about, by understanding networks and the positive aspects of them?
Well, in many ways, the last book I did, The Square and the Tower, was sort of like the preliminary work for this book, because I decided that I needed to immerse myself in network science and teach myself about it, because it felt like historians should really understand this stuff. A lot of the time we're studying social networks. We don't realize we are, but that's what we're doing. And that book was really, for me, a pathway into understanding contagion. You summarize some of the key points in The Square and the Tower, which I put into this book as a kind of refresher. But the key thing is that in any contagion, whether it's a contagion of the body caused by a virus or something similar, or a contagion of the mind caused by a meme, if you want to use Richard Dawkins's word. The same thing is true in each case. You need to understand the pathogen or the meme, the thing itself, but you also need to understand the structure of the network it's attacking. And in fact, that's about as important. Now, I learned this from reading people like Laszlo Barabasi, one of the great network scientists, physicist by training, but somebody who's done path-breaking work on network structure. And the key insight is that networks, social networks between human beings are not like lattices. Each human being does not have the same number of nodes as the rest, the same number of edges rather as the rest. But actually, the structure of a social network is very often something close to scale free, i.e. a tiny number of nodes have a vast number of connections, and a great many nodes have hardly any at all. If you want to kind of get an intuitive sense of what I'm talking about, look at follower numbers on Twitter. There aren't.
Well, this is Neil. This is what you talk about is how like a catastrophe can become a dragon king. I think in chapter 4, you talk about how those super connected nodes, right, can really magnify the effect. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it just got me thinking about this term dragon king versus the gray rhinos and the black swan.
Every interesting distribution has a fat tail.
Yeah.
And these fat tail events are really what the book
super
is about.
spreaders.
And the super spreaders, who were such a key part of what happened with COVID-19.
You included, as you point out.
I might well have been one. We'll never know, because I don't know if I had COVID-19 back in January, February of last year, because you couldn't get tested, because CDC didn't know how to organize large-scale testing. But let's just try and step back and understand what super spreaders are, because super spreaders have played a part in contagions in the past. For example, in HIV/AIDS, it was identified quite early on that a relatively small number of people were doing a lot of the spreading. These were people with many, many sexual partners. Well, in the same way that there were super spreaders with COVID, people who were more gregarious, a lot more gregarious than most people. I tell the story of one woman in South Korea who did a really extraordinary amount of the spreading of COVID in that country in the space of just a few days, in which she was just going to church and going to multiple social events. So super spreaders were important because this particular disease had a low dispersion factor, which translates into lay language as follows. About 20% of the infected people did 80% of the spreading. And this heterogeneity, which is really a function of network structure, is one reason that our response to the pandemic, the very blunt instrument of lockdowns, was not a particularly clever one. Whereas the response of the South Koreans and the Taiwanese, which was ramp up testing and then use contact tracing to figure out who might have been infected and then isolate or quarantine the people who were infected, that worked far, far better with much lower economic and social costs. So I think network science turned out to be absolutely crucial to understanding the public health problem presented by COVID-19. And it seemed to me as if public health experts in the West didn't get that and didn't understand because they hadn't really learned the lessons of SARS and MERS, previous but much smaller coronavirus related epidemics. Can I just throw in one other thought, which I think kind of connects our different worlds? As I was writing about military disasters, I kept being struck by how many armies were defeated by disease rather than by the enemy. And that armies, at times in, say, European history, when there were a great many infectious diseases for which there were no remedies, armies were great ways of transporting disease around the place. Not only were the soldiers succumbing, but anybody that they encountered amongst the civilian population did too. And it struck me, one of the things that has really become different about modern warfare is that that's much less true. But it's a relatively recent thing that armies can focus on killing one another rather than succumbing to disease. The other thing that really struck me as I was thinking about this is the way that you can have these simultaneous plagues of the body and plagues of the mind. And that comes out very clearly when you look at the tail end of World War I. When you have both the plague, the ideological plague of Bolshevism, and then the Spanish influenza, one of the worst pandemics in all of history, which ends up killing more people than the war itself had. So these themes, I think, illustrate why networks are such a useful way of thinking about historical disasters, because nearly all of the great contagions are really as much a function of network structure as they are a function of the pathogens themselves.
I'll just point out, Neil, when I was commissioned in the Army in 1984. Now, of course, everybody is familiar with hand washing stations and field sanitation. But one of my first duties as a new lieutenant was I was the field sanitation officer as an additional duty, who had to make sure that everything was in place to prevent the kind of outbreak that, of course, we had learned from across so many disasters associated with disease, exacting, as you mentioned, a much higher toll than the battlefield had.
So, Neil, I want to ask you a larger question, which is, in some sense, I find your book hopeful, and it's the following: as we're all sort of hyphenated conservatives, which means we worry about society falling apart, which will be a combination of internal decay and some external pressure. Your disasters are awful, but in so many cases, societies did not fall apart. So the bubonic plague, which we think of as 1350, but was really 1350 to the late 1700s in many ways, killed half of the people around. It was not totally pleasant afterwards. The Renaissance may have been culturally interesting to those of us who like paintings and art, but was a much more violent and turbulent time. But nonetheless, society held together in an unimaginable way. If you think of, half of the people dying. After World War II, think of the devastation in Europe after World War II. Yet within 20 years, Germany and Japan were back together. They had some resilience, some networks, some social structure. Now we can think, of course, of places that didn't. And I don't want to, the Holocaust was absolutely, that was a society that was wiped out. But, Germany recovered from this unbelievable disaster, far worse than the pandemic we've just been through. Now, of course, there's contrasts. The Antonine plagues seem to have something to do with the fall of Rome, which is the thing that conservatives always worry about, that there a society, a legal system did completely fall apart. And the biggest of all, 1491, with something like 95% of the original inhabitants of the Americas and their society fell apart. Now it seems to need, in those cases, you've got a plague and a military defeat, which happened at the same time and just wipe out the societies. And you can think of other examples. We think of the end of the Ottoman Empire, empires that rot from within and then just get kicked off. Although, Turkey itself recovered in many ways. So the larger thought, there seems to be a resilience in strong societies. There seems to be a fragility in weak societies. Where are we?
It's a great question, and you're right that the book is in many ways an optimistic book, and the title Doom is an ironic one. Part of what I try to show early on in the book is that we're fascinated by the notion of the end of days. We've been fascinated by the idea of some apocalyptic end to humanity.
I love the Monty Python skit, by the way. And over my right shoulder, you'll see the complete works of Monty Python on my desk here with the rainbow cover.
I want to reassure viewers that Monty Python plays an important part, along with Beyond the Fringe and other gems of British comedy, in explaining why ideas of catastrophic annihilation are attractive to us, but we tend to exaggerate the likelihood of total catastrophe. And this is very, very contagious is perhaps not the right word to use, but when you listen to some of the discussions of climate change, when people predict the end of the world in 12 years, which I think was 2 years ago, so it must be 10 years away if you want to put that in your calendars. I mean, that sort of thing is very, very recurrent in human history. But it's not really the end of the world, the extinction of humanity that we need to worry about. It's disasters that kill a minority of us, from which we usually recover. The cases of complete and irretrievable disaster, and you mentioned a very good example, the obliteration of the native peoples of America, particularly the great civilizations of Central and South America, by not European conquest, because the conquistadors did relatively little of the damage. Most of the damage was done by the various bugs that they brought with them from Europe. But that's a very unusual case. The Easter Island story is one that, long fascinated anthropologists like Jared Diamond. But when you look closely at that story, it turns out not to be the parable of environmental degradation leading to oblivion that we were once told about. Actually, the reasons why Easter Island is not or was not a viable society are rather different from the environmental story. But most civilizations proved to be remarkably resilient, even in the face of far worse disasters than COVID-19. The Roman Empire was attacked by multiple plagues. That's not really the reason that the Roman Empire very slowly declined and fell. And so I think the answer to your question, John, is that it's unlikely that the United States is in such a weakened state that collapse is imminent. But one of the arguments I make towards the end of the book is that the big danger for any free society is not so much the threat from outside. I think there is a significant threat, as we've discussed many times on this show, from the People's Republic of China. But the real threat is actually from within. If you think about the 20th century, the most dangerous force of all was totalitarianism. It's totalitarian regimes that are responsible for the worst examples of mass death, of premature and often violent death. And all the major totalitarian regimes were responsible for tens of millions of deaths. If there's one thing that worries me, it's that we are slipping and sliding into a kind of totalitarianism in the free societies of the West. It's not happening because Big Brother has taken power. It's happening because we don't realize that totalitarian forms of behavior are beginning to spread. Denunciations, the informing, the cancellation, the airbrushing out of things that are suddenly deemed to be ideologically incorrect. So I end the book by saying, look, we have a lot of things to worry about, from cyber warfare to climate change, yes, by all means, to the next pandemic, to a nuclear war, which is not something that's been removed from the list of risks. But maybe the biggest risk is actually that societies around the world succumb again to totalitarianism, given that totalitarianism has been such a disastrous killer in the past.
Neil, I'd like to segue to the cover of your book here for a second. Speaking of humor, there it is. Somebody playing golf with a fire raging behind. What's the old joke? Makes for a tricky par four. Let's talk a moment, Neil, about the state of California, the state in which all four of us live, the state in which we're all paying taxes a week from now to California. I'm curious as to what that cover may say about the California existence, Neil, and what you've learned about California in the past year or so, the pandemic, on the note of totalitarianism.
When I saw that photograph, which I think was taken a few years ago in Oregon, actually, I remember thinking, yeah, that is a beautiful metaphor for much that is strange about modern American society, that you're in fact on the brink of a calamity, in this case a wildfire, but you're focusing on sinking that putt. And I like the idea of using this on the jacket of the book, partly because I didn't want people to think this was yet another book about COVID, which it's not. COVID is discussed towards the end, but this is a general history of disaster. But I also wanted to allude to the other kind of disaster that, in fact, was pretty spectacular in this part of the world last year, the extraordinary wildfires that swept California. And of course, those illustrate the point about the politics of catastrophe rather well, because while it's very tempting for people to say, there's the proof that climate change is going to cause disaster, in truth, as we, I think, discussed on the show at the time, the wildfire problem is a function of poor public policy. And in particular, the growing difficulty of controlled burn in areas that would in the past have been subject to controlled burn for environmental and other reasons. So California's got itself into a terrible predicament by stopping what used to happen, natural and controlled burn, and creating a huge potential for really large-scale fires. And it's almost impossible at this point to figure out how that problem can be solved, because vast parts of the state are effectively kindling, just waiting to go up. And there isn't really any conceivable way that you could do a controlled burn of such a large area. So yeah, I do think California is a good example of what can go wrong in a prosperous society. They don't come much more prosperous than California. And yet over the last, let's say 20 or 30 years, multiple failures of public policy have produced all kinds of social and economic pathologies. The wildfires are only one. The education system, the public schools have become a kind of a parable of poor public policy, exemplified by the absurdity of San Francisco's schools being renamed, but being closed and still closed, so that a year of education has been lost by the poorer kids of this area. I could go on and on about what's wrong with California. Please stop me. But the key point is that this illustrates the political nature of catastrophe. None of the things that are wrong with California can be attributed to nature unassisted by terrible policy decisions.
Yes, John, I interrupted you, so back to you, my friend.
Oh, well, you want me to go on to California? Yes,
Neil said his piece on California.
Well, it's a good example of a political system that's lost its capacity to adapt competently. We haven't built a dam since the 1950s. The housing thing is stuck in the mud. Everybody recognizes what's wrong with the housing situation in California. They're just unable to do the fires. With $2 trillion in stimulus, we ought to be able to hire people to just go out with bulldozers and cut the stuff down if it mattered to us. Unfortunately, we're going to waste it all on other things. Where I wanted to go with Neil, though, I wanted to push on the larger question. I know we're heading towards closing here. And I think you brought up something very good. Really, the closest we came to the collapse of Western civilization event was World War I, which, Germany really didn't recover at that time. Russia did not recover. And, World War I really set off World War II, which could have ended much, much worse. The remarkable recovery is the whole Western world. Really, let's put 1945 as the beginning of the recovery from the World War I calamity. But that leads to, and you're worried about the rise of totalitarianism, as I am too. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It is a force now. There were bombings and anarchists in the 1905 era as well. But it took on in the wake of calamity. So I see us perhaps as the 1905 Europe, not quite yet the 1918 Europe. And that's my question for, suppose we had a pandemic. We're now an incredibly prosperous society, healthier. Each year up till 2019 was the best year ever in human prosperity terms, peaceful. Rates of violence, despite what you read in the newspaper, are way down. All the official indicators are good. Yet we are tearing ourselves apart over, Jeff Bezos might have made more money starting Amazon than we would like. Scientific American just declared climate a formal emergency over issues that are, maybe they're right, but they don't seem to me like quite the order of the disasters of World War I, or of, let me get to the point, 50% of the population dying. A society that is so torn apart over objectively fairly small issues. Suppose we had a pandemic that killed 50% of Americans in the current situation. Suppose we had a nuclear war. I'm interested by your book, by the way, that environmental catastrophe doesn't show up anywhere in history as being the disaster that brings down a civilization. So that one doesn't, at least if we do it now, it will be something new. But suppose we have a real catastrophe on a historical scale. Do we have the resilience to say, okay, we're going to stop fighting each other and rebuild the American structure, the resilient rule of law, social structures that was able to adapt in the past? Or has now the bureaucratic the bureaucratic fossilization and the emergence will the totalitarians use that as the time to take over? And if we think about the end of American civilization, the disaster that befalls us, we're so hyper specialized. Unlike the Romans, we can't go back to farms. All of us we barely know how to. I can't grow flowers in my backyard, let alone wheat. The end of that civilization strikes me as just hugely worse than going back to the Middle Ages, and that the totalitarianism would bring. So it's a long way of saying, do you see us? It won't just happen on its own, but it would happen through a lack of resilience to the next big shock. And do you see us in that danger?
Well, we certainly need to think about much worse case scenarios than we've just lived through.
Yes,
because it's certainly clear that the pandemic was only barely a top 20 pandemic.
The fire drill.
And so you can think of it as a fire drill. If you imagine a pathogen that's significantly more lethal, closer to 1918-19 influenza, then you end up with 2 million Americans conceivably dying, and a global death toll in the hundreds of millions conceivably. So there's no question that scenario has a non-zero probability. We don't know what the hell it is, but there's some reason to worry about it. And I also think that as long as nuclear weapons are part of the arsenal of superpowers, you can't dismiss out of hand the possibility of a nuclear war. And I noticed that Admiral Jim Stavridis' new novel, 2034, which imagines a US-China war, quite quickly escalates into nuclear war, with cities in both China and the United States being destroyed. I wonder, if you ask the question, could we cope with a worse disaster? It's tempting to say, well, looking at how badly we cope with this medium-tier disaster, it's not too bright a prospect. I sometimes simply ask the question, what if a cyber attack takes out the internet for a period of time? How does the US function if we're all suddenly offline? Not only would GoodFellows have to be cancelled, but there are a number of significantly worse things that would ensue from that. So we could have a complete societal collapse without significant initial casualties, simply because the critical technological infrastructure that we've come to depend on crashed. And that, again, is a scenario that HR knows much more about than I do. But you have to worry about that scenario in the event of a US-China-Russia conflict, because that has to be what they would prioritize if they were trying to disable us. I don't know. I mean, I've been through phases of deep pessimism about the resilience of American society, watching some of the absurdities of the last year, the politicization of everything from masks to vaccines, the ways in which the internet has acted as a kind of transmission mechanism for crazy ideas on both the right and the left. But I think I'm going to say this tentatively, that in the face of a really serious disaster, American society would actually outperform after initially seeming completely hopeless. And this reminds me of Churchill's old dictum that the United States always does the right thing when all the other alternatives have been exhausted. American disaster takes the following form. It starts off really badly. It's the post-Pearl Harbor story. And then after that initial fail, you get this extraordinary rallying, unity, and the unleashing of energy. Because the United States recruits a lot of talented people, I'm not blowing my own trumpet here, its basic mode of operation is to attract talent through immigration. When the crisis strikes, there's a lot of talent and energy to be unleashed. And my suspicion is that the highly regimented, centrally planned societies, such as the People's Republic of China, might actually not perform as well in the kind of disaster scenario you're talking about, John. So I'm at the risk of sounding like the doom-laden optimist. I think there is some reason to think that we might do better than your question implies.
Well, in response to war, America has always come together quickly, and it has reinforced, the strength and social structures. And you're right, totalitarian countries tend not to. So, though I think a nuclear war would be a horrible disaster, that doesn't strike me as the society-ending one. We did actually quite well. America's right now tops in the pandemic because they did one thing right, which was get the vaccines going, an absolute miracle of technology, but also of government. And we're now leading the world on that. I think, therefore, the danger, the society-ending dangers are more the ones that come internally. California prioritized its vaccine to, and this is a quote, redress historic inequities, as opposed to stop a pandemic that's going. So if you have bodies in the streets, those kind of internal dissensions are more likely to come out than if you have an external aggressor. You've mentioned so many other things. We've talked about antibiotic-resistant bacteria or crop failure. I think the danger for the U.S. falling apart is not a clear external state actor, but something that really stresses our internal divisions.
Of course, when full-blown disaster strikes, we're all going to go and work on Victor Davis Hanson's farm because he alone amongst the fellows knows how to farm. So we won't be completely done at Hoover.
Victor Hanson needs to buy fertilizer, seed, oil to keep his tractors going. And he needs to have people on the farm who know how to use guns, which only one of us has any chance of. So
I think if HR handles the security around the perimeter, Hoover Farm in the post-apocalyptic world will be the place to be. And I certainly give us better chances of success than certain other institutions at Stanford in the apocalyptic scenario.
So, gentlemen, we have about a couple of minutes left, gentlemen. So one last question for Neil. Neil, we haven't talked about 1957 in the course of this broadcast. And I mention that because it's a year of historic landmarks. Sputnik goes into space. John Cochrane enters the world, I believe, in 1957. And a virus reaches America's shores, the politically incorrect now Asian flu. As we look back at 1957, Neil, and look at the hand dealt to us today, is 1957, Neil, a tale of different political leadership? Is it a tale of different government? Is it a tale of different society? Because you mentioned in the book, teenagers were ravaged by that flu. I assume that would include a young Joe Biden who would be 15 going on 16 in that year, but yet schools didn't close, society didn't close, life went on.
All of the above is the answer. Obviously, it's not exactly the same, and it would be a mistake to suggest that. The US didn't do too badly compared with last year in 1957 when the Asian flu struck. But globally, these two disasters are very similar. It's about the same proportion of the world's population that is killed by the 57-58 Asian flu. And the responses in the United States are really almost exactly the opposite. There's no state of emergency, no school closures, no lockdowns. Almost no money is spent by the federal government. There is no economic shock detectable. There's a mild recession. It has nothing to do with the pandemic. And I think you have to clock this up to, firstly, President Eisenhower's leadership. He was, to put it mildly, experienced when it came to dealing with disastrous situations. The public health bureaucracy did a good job. It advised Eisenhower they couldn't stop the spread of the virus, and therefore the best thing to do was to focus on getting a vaccine, which they did in an extraordinarily short space of time. And then you have to say that the society itself was more resilient and less divided. I think it's very striking when one reads the accounts of that time, and I've had numerous emails from people with memories of 57, that Americans took this threat to their health much more in their stride and didn't allow it to become politicized. So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from 57, 58. They tell us a lot about how our government has become much less functional. I think it also shows us how our society then was a great deal more cohesive and in some ways anti-fragile.
Okay. John, in HR, we may not be seeing our friend Neil for a while here. He has a book to promote. Any last thoughts you'd like to say about the book and about your friend?
Hey, Neil, I really enjoyed it. What we didn't talk about today was also, I think, the lessons that are in the book for leaders, especially leaders who are in charge of complex organizations and should endeavor to make those organizations more resilient and resistant to catastrophes. Chapter 8 was what I'm thinking of in particular, where you talk about how complex systems can go critical and so forth. And I just want to say again, congratulations on a really, really great book. The other thing I'll just mention, I guess, is that this book is really so multidimensional. I also think it is in some ways the historiography of meta history, and I really appreciated your criticisms about how we understand human experience from a historical perspective, and where the potential pitfalls are of misunderstanding that experience. So, just a wonderful job on the book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I know our listeners and viewers will as well.
John,
thanks so much.
I want to say the same thing. That was a great book. I really enjoyed it. I think our last thought leads us to the point of the historian. The real question for the next pandemic is: do we learn from the mistakes this time, or do we enshrine what we did last time as inevitable wisdom and start by locking down the economy and throwing $7 trillion out the window, multiplied by however much worse the next pandemic is than this one? I would hope that we read some history and learn from the mistakes rather than simply repeat them in order to confirm that it was so wise last time.
Can I just say as we wrap, thank you to all involved with GoodFellows for the way in which, as I was writing this book, I was getting weekly stimulus. John in particular was incredibly generous with his time and reading the thing in draft and finding lots of mistakes, which I hope I mostly corrected. But to viewers of GoodFellows, let me just stress that this is actually an incredibly vibrant intellectual community that I'm lucky enough to be a part of. And if the book is not a disaster in its own right, then it must be in large measure thanks to my colleagues at Hoover.
Thank you, Neil. The title of the book, once again, Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe. It is out today. You have run out of excuses for getting it. Buy it now. And that's a wrap for this episode of GoodFellows, but don't despair. We'll be back next week with a new topic, new conversation. Meantime, keep those questions coming, and you can send them to our website we've created for you, and that website is hoover.org/askgoodfellows. Let me repeat that for you, hoover.org/askgoodfellows. Niall Ferguson's book, yet again, I'm going to remind you one more time, Doom, the Politics of Catastrophe. Great conversation today, folks. Neil, good luck on the book tour. We hope to see you soon back on this channel. On the behalf of Hoover's GoodFellows, Niall Ferguson, H.R. McMaster, John Cochrane, all of us here at the Hoover Institution, we wish you and yours the very best. By all means, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll do our best here at the Hoover Institution to help you stay informed. We'll see you next week.
If you enjoyed this show and are interested in watching more content featuring H.R. McMaster, watch Battlegrounds, also available at hoover.org.